In the glare of studio lights at the Burbank soundstage, a queen of comedy prepared to spar with a legend of discipline. What was supposed to be another easy afternoon of laughter turned uneasy when mockery met immovable faith, and the crowd realized the punchline had changed direction. Ellen DeGeneres wasn't your average talk show host. For 20 years, she danced, joked, and disarmed the biggest names in the world with charm that made cynicism look harmless. But beneath the laughter was a performer addicted to control until one guest refused to play by her script. When Ellen laughed at his faith, she thought she was teasing a myth. Instead, she provoked a man whose power didn't come from muscle, but from meaning. Chuck's quiet reply, measured, unwavering, stopped the show cold, igniting a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio walls. What began as a talk show segment would become a turning point where satire gave way to silence, and silence became the loudest sermon Hollywood had ever heard. The audience came for jokes. They left with something closer to revelation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The studio pulsed with that signature energy of daytime television. Bright, electric, almost too cheerful. Overhead lights bathed everything in a flattering glow that masked imperfections, while the house band's upbeat rhythm kept the audience swaying between segments. Behind the scenes, producers darted between equipment, their voices urgent in headsets, counting down to the next segment with practiced precision. In the green room, Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees. At 79, his posture remained impeccable, spine straight, shoulders squared, yet somehow completely at ease. His weathered face had settled into the kind of calm that comes from decades of discipline, both physical and spiritual. The martial arts legend wore simple clothes, crisp blue button down, dark jeans, polished boots, no flashy jewelry, no designer labels screaming for attention, just the small cross pendant that had hung around his neck for years. A young production assistant hovered nervously in the doorway. 5 minutes, Mr. Norris. Chuck nodded, the slight movement deliberate. Thank you. Just 2 words, but spoken with genuine appreciation. The assistant hesitated. I just wanted to say my grandfather and I used to watch your movies together. You were his hero. A warm smile crossed Chuck's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. That's kind of you to share. The moment was interrupted by Sam Jenkins, the show's executive producer, who appeared behind the assistant with a tablet clutched to his chest. In his late 40s, Sam had the harried look of someone perpetually managing chaos, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes darting constantly to his device. Chuck, great to have you on the show, Sam said, extending his hand. Ellen's excited. It's been years since your last visit. Chuck stood, his movement fluid despite his age. Happy to be here. So, Sam continued, scrolling through his tablet. Just a heads up, Ellen might bring up those internet jokes about you. You know, the Chuck Norris facts thing? It's still viral gold. Chuck's smile remained easy. I've heard a few. Some are pretty creative. Sam's shoulders relaxed slightly. Great. Great. She'll probably touch on the new charity work, your martial arts schools, maybe a bit about the ranch. Keep it light. Fun, that's the Ellen way. What Sam wouldn't mention, was Ellen's recent producer meeting, where she'd circled Chuck's faith in her notes. Good TV sometimes needs a little tension, she'd said with a wink. Audiences love it when I push back a little on the God stuff. The audience erupted as Ellen danced down the aisles to Mark Ronson's Uptown Funk, her trademark short blonde hair bouncing with each step. She high-fived front-row audience members, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she twirled and gestured for everyone to stand. The energy was infectious, exactly the controlled chaos she'd perfected over years of hosting. "Welcome, everybody! Welcome," she said, slightly breathless as she took center stage. Her tailored suit hung perfectly on her slender frame, the bright blue fabric popping under the studio lights. "What an amazing audience we have today. You look beautiful. Are you feeling beautiful? Because you look it." The crowd roared in response, faces glowing with the simple joy of being acknowledged. Ellen nodded approvingly, hands in her pockets, bouncing slightly on her toes. "So, today is going to be special," she continued, her voice taking on the conspiratorial tone that made millions of viewers feel like they were in on some private joke. "We've got a legend in the building, an actual, certified legend." In the production booth, Sam watched the monitors intently, earpiece buzzing with the constant communication of a live show. His assistant director leaned over. "Chuck's ready at the entrance." Sam nodded, eyes never leaving the screens. "Ellen's in a mood today. Could be interesting." On stage, Ellen was warming up the audience. "So before we bring him out, let me ask how many of you have heard of Chuck Norris Files?" The audience cheered, many raising their hands. "Right? Like, Chuck Norris doesn't call the wrong number, you answer the wrong phone." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Or my personal favorite, Chuck Norris counted to infinity. Twice." More laughter, louder this time. Ellen grinned, pacing the stage with practiced ease. "Well, the man behind the myths is here today. Please welcome martial arts legend, actor, and internet phenomenon Chuck Norris." The band struck up a rendition of the Walker, Texas Ranger theme as Chuck walked onto the stage. His entrance wasn't flashy, no running, no dramatic gestures, just a man walking with purpose and humility. The audience stood anyway, applause thundering through the studio. Several people whistled, a few shouted his name. Ellen met him center stage with her arms outstretched. Chuck embraced her warmly, genuinely. Before they both took their seats, Ellen perching on the edge of her chair with characteristic energy, Chuck settling in with relaxed confidence. "Welcome back to the show," Ellen said, still grinning. "It's been way too long." "Thank you, Ellen. Great to be here," Chuck replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly warmth that had delivered countless one-liners on screen. "So, I have to ask those Chuck Norris facts. Do you have a favorite?" Chuck chuckled, the sound gentle and authentic. "Well, they keep making new ones. But I like Chuck Norris doesn't read books. He stares them down until he gets the information he wants." The audience laughed appreciatively, and Ellen leaned back in her chair. "That's a good one. Though I always pictured you as a reader." "Oh, I am," Chuck nodded. "The Bible daily. History books, biographies. I'm actually a big C.S. Lewis fan." Ellen's eyebrows raised slightly, almost imperceptibly at the mention of the Bible. In the booth, Sam noticed immediately and leaned forward. "The Bible, huh?" Ellen said lightly, maintaining her smile. "Every day? That's commitment." Chuck nodded, completely at ease. "It centers me. Starts my day right." "I usually start mine with coffee and Instagram," Ellen quipped, drawing laughs. Different approaches to morning motivation. The conversation shifted to Chuck's recent projects. His charitable foundation, a new series of martial arts schools opening across the country, his ranch in Texas. Ellen was in her element, keeping the pace quick, the tone light. The audience stayed engaged, laughing at the right moments, attentive during others. 20 minutes into the interview, Ellen circled back. "So, all these accomplishments, the films, the martial arts championships, the charity work, What keeps you grounded through all of it? What's the Chuck Norris secret? It was a standard talk show question, the kind designed to elicit either a humble deflection or an inspirational soundbite. Chuck took a moment before responding, his expression thoughtful. My faith keeps me grounded, he said simply. Knowing that whatever I achieve or whatever challenges I face, I'm not facing them alone. God's been my strength through everything. The studio remained respectfully quiet. In the control booth, Sam shifted in his chair, recognizing Ellen's subtle change in posture, the slight tilt of her head, the focused gleam in her eye that often preceded her more pointed questions. Faith? Ellen echoed, her tone still light but edged with curiosity. Like prayer? And all that? Chuck nodded, untroubled by the simplification. Prayer, scripture, trying to live by example. It's the foundation of everything for me. Ellen glanced at the audience, then back at Chuck. That's really old school, Chuck. I mean, in Hollywood especially. Chuck smiled. Some things don't need updating. A few audience members chuckled. Others nodded in agreement. Ellen sensed the split response and instinctively moved to keep control of the room's energy. Well, I guess whatever works, she said with a quick smile. We'll be right back with more from Chuck Norris after this break. As the show cut to commercial, the lights dimmed slightly. Ellen leaned over to Chuck. Going well. When we come back, I thought we'd play a little game, Fact or Fiction. Chuck Norris edition. Fun way to play with those internet myths. Sounds good, Chuck replied easily. In the darkened production booth, Sam watched Ellen's expression change when she thought the cameras weren't on her, the calculating look that crossed her face as she glanced at her note cards. He pressed his earpiece closer. Keep camera 3 tight on both of them when we come back, he instructed. I have a feeling this is about to get interesting. The commercial break ended with the camera pulling back to reveal Ellen and Chuck, now both holding blue paddles with fact written on one side and fiction on the other. The audience settled back into their seats, energy rebuilding after the brief intermission. Welcome back, everybody, Ellen announced. We're here with the legendary Chuck Norris, and we're about to play a little game called Fact or Fiction, Chuck Norris edition. She turned to Chuck with an exaggerated wink. Now, Chuck, you've probably heard most of these internet facts about yourself, but I want to know what you think of them. All you have to do is hold up fact if it's true, or fiction if it's made up. Sound good? Chuck nodded, holding his paddle loosely. I'm ready. All right, here we go. Ellen continued. Chuck Norris has counted to infinity. Twice. The audience laughed as Chuck promptly held up fiction, shaking his head with a good-natured smile. But you've tried. And, quote, no. Of Gray. Chen. Tu intere. Ellen pressed. Eyebrows raised. Got to about 27 before I got distracted. Chuck replied dryly, earning more laughter. Ellen glanced at her cards. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. This time, Chuck paused thoughtfully before slowly raising the fact paddle. His expression deadpan. The crowd erupted in delight. I knew it! Ellen exclaimed, pointing at him triumphantly. That explains earthquakes. The game continued with Chuck playing along, the audience thoroughly entertained by both the ridiculous claims and his willingness to embrace the absurdity. Ellen was in her element, each response feeding her next quip, the energy building with each exchange. Last one, Ellen said, glancing briefly off stage where Sam stood watching. Chuck Norris is so tough, he once made a paper airplane that shot down a MiG fighter jet. Chuck raised. Fiction. Chuckling. Though that would have saved the government a lot of money. Ellen set her cards aside. leaning forward slightly. You know what's interesting, these jokes are all about how tough you are, how powerful, how unbeatable. But earlier you mentioned that your strength comes from faith, right? Her tone remained light, but there was an edge to it now, subtle, almost imperceptible. That's right, Chuck answered simply. So, do you actually think God helps you win fights? Ellen asked, her voice carrying just a hint of mockery. Several audience members laughed uncertainly. Chuck's expression remained unchanged. Well, I haven't been in a real fight in decades, but I believe God gives me strength in all challenges, yes. Ellen nodded, a smile playing at her lips. So before a big scene in one of your movies, you'd pray that the roundhouse kick would land just right. She mimed a kick, drawing more laughter from the audience, though some faces showed discomfort. In the control booth, Sam straightened. "Keep camera 2 on Chuck's face," he murmured into his headset. "And camera 1 ready for audience reactions. I would pray for focus, for safety, for everyone involved," Chuck answered calmly. "Film sets can be dangerous places. But you're Chuck Norris," Ellen pressed, her voice taking on an exaggerated tone of awe. "Creator of the fighting system Chun Kuk Do. Black belt in 6 different disciplines. Literally undefeatable according to the internet. You need divine intervention for that?" Her emphasis on divine intervention drew scattered laughter. Louder this time. Chuck's posture remained relaxed, but his eyes focused more intently on Ellen. Not angry, not defensive, simply present and attentive. In that subtle shift, something in the atmosphere changed. "Strength comes in many forms, Ellen," he said quietly. Sure. Ellen nodded, continuing. "I just find it fascinating that someone known worldwide for physical power would attribute it to, something you can't see or prove." She turned to the audience with a half shrug and an expression that invited them to share her bemusement. The audience response was mixed. Some laughed appreciatively, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in the front row glanced at his companion with a raised eyebrow. "I mean, come on," Ellen continued, building momentum. "Next you'll tell me that when you did those epic fight scenes in The Way of the Dragon with Bruce Lee, you were just channeling the Holy Spirit?" She adopted a mock-serious expression and raised her hands in a prayer gesture. This time, the laughter was scattered and uncertain. A few audience members exchanged glances. In the wings, Sam pressed his earpiece tighter and muttered something to his assistant. Chuck remained unmoved, his breathing steady, his expression calm, but no longer smiling. The contrast between Ellen's increasingly animated mockery and his stillness was becoming more pronounced with each passing second. "Actually," Chuck responded, his voice still gentle, but carrying easily across the now quieting studio, "Bruce and I had great respect for each other's beliefs and practices. He found his center through his own spiritual journey. I found mine through Christ." Ellen sensed the subtle shift in the room's energy, but pressed on, perhaps feeling the need to reassert control. "So all those Chuck Norris facts should really be God facts then? God doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down?" She laughed at her own joke, glancing at the audience expectantly. A few obligatory chuckles followed, but the momentum was changing. Camera 2 captured a middle-aged woman in the second row who had stopped laughing altogether, her expression thoughtful as she looked at Chuck. "God doesn't need facts or jokes, Ellen," Chuck replied evenly. "He just is." Ellen paused, caught slightly off guard by the simplicity of his response. She recovered quickly, reaching for another angle. "But don't you think it's a little, I don't know, old-fashioned? In 2025, with all we know about science and the universe, to still believe in divine intervention?" Her tone was conversational, but carried an undercurrent of challenge. "I mean, Isn't it easier to just admit that you worked really hard and got really good at martial arts because of practice, not prayer? This time, the audience was noticeably quiet, the atmosphere shifting from entertainment to something more complex. A few people appeared uncomfortable. Others leaned forward with interest. And some nodded along with Ellen's questioning. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chuck took a measured breath before responding. On camera, he appeared completely at ease. Not a hint of defensiveness in his posture or expression. This wasn't the tense silence of someone searching for a retort or feeling attacked. It was the patient pause of someone who had faced far greater challenges than pointed questions on a talk show. "Faith isn't about what's easy, Ellen," he said finally. "And it's never been at odds with hard work or science. For me, my accomplishments came through discipline, practice, and dedication. But my purpose, my center, that comes from something deeper." Ellen leaned back slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. Perhaps at his articulation, perhaps at his continued composure. She recovered with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, I guess having an imaginary friend never hurt anyone," she said, her tone making it clear it was meant as a joke. "I had one named Sparkles when I was 7. This time, the laughter was noticeably strained. In the front row, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses frowned slightly. Beside her, an older man shifted in his seat, his expression neutral but attentive. In the control booth, Sam leaned toward his assistant director. "We should move to the charity segment," he murmured. "This is getting—" But Ellen was already continuing, gaining momentum again, perhaps sensing she needed to recapture the room. "I mean, seriously," she said, her voice louder now, more animated. "Isn't it a little bizarre that Chuck Norris, the man who, according to the internet, doesn't sleep, he waits needs to pray before action scenes? What's next? A Bible study with Jean-Claude Van Damme?" A few audience members laughed more from the mental image than from genuine amusement. But the atmosphere had unmistakably changed. The easy rhythm of the show had been replaced by something tense and uncertain. Chuck sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His expression remained neutral, not angry, not hurt, simply present and attentive. The contrast between Ellen's increasingly animated mockery and his stillness was stark and impossible to ignore. "So," Ellen continued, leaning forward with an exaggerated expression of curiosity, "did God tell you to kick all those guys in the movies too? Was that divine guidance? And lo, the Lord said unto Chuck, roundhouse kick that guy into next Tuesday?" She mimicked a booming voice, glancing at the audience with a smile that invited them to join her amusement. A few scattered laughs echoed across the studio, quickly fading into an uncomfortable silence. The camera captured the varied expressions in the audience, some still smiling uncertainly, others watching with growing discomfort, and a few looking directly at Chuck with something like concern or curiosity. For a moment, Chuck remained silent, his eyes steady on Ellen's face. Not challenging, not angry, simply present. The studio grew quieter still, the tension almost palpable. Then Chuck spoke, his voice soft but crystal clear in the hushed studio. "No," he said, the word hanging in the air. "But he taught me when not to fight." The simplicity of his response, delivered without anger or defensiveness, seemed to expand in the silence that followed. It wasn't a counterattack or a religious platitude. It was a truth spoken from experience, from a life lived. Ellen's smile faltered slightly, her next quip dying, unspoken on her lips. For the first time in the interview, Perhaps for one of the few times in her long career as a host, she seemed genuinely at a loss for words. In the control booth, Sam slowly lowered his clipboard, his eyes fixed on the monitor, showing Chuck's face calm, dignified, unshaken. "Go to commercial," he said quietly into his headset. 2-minute break. But before the director could respond, Ellen had already found her voice again. "We'll be right back after this break," she said, her professionalism reasserting itself, though her usual brightness seemed dimmed. "With more from Chuck Norris." As the on-air light dimmed and commercials began to play, the studio remained unusually quiet. Ellen glanced at her producer off stage, then back at Chuck, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Chuck hadn't moved, hadn't changed his expression. He simply sat, present and calm, in the eye of a storm he hadn't created, but wouldn't flee. When the on-air light flickered back to life, the studio felt different, charged with an energy that wasn't there before. The audience had used the commercial break to murmur among themselves, casting glances at Chuck and Ellen, who had remained in their seats. Unlike the usual lively atmosphere that typically followed breaks, with audience members resettling and chattering, an unusual attentiveness had settled over the room. Ellen had composed herself during the break, straightening her blazer and conferring briefly with a producer who had slipped her a note. She offered a professional smile as the cameras began rolling again. "Welcome back," she said, her voice carrying its familiar warmth, though perhaps a touch more measured than before. "We're here with Chuck Norris, talking about his incredible career and his new charitable foundation." She turned toward Chuck, whose expression remained unchanged. Not upset, not defensive, simply present. "So Chuck," Ellen continued, clearly steering toward safer territory, "tell us about the Kickstart Kids Foundation. I understand it's celebrating its 30th anniversary this year?" Chuck nodded, seemingly content with the change in direction. "That's right. We've reached over 100,000 kids now, teaching them martial arts, discipline, and life skills." "That's impressive," Ellen said, settling back into her familiar role. "What made you start it?" "I saw too many kids without direction, without hope," Chuck replied, his voice warm with genuine passion. "Martial arts gave me discipline when I was younger, taught me respect, perseverance, integrity. These values can transform lives." The audience nodded appreciatively, the atmosphere gradually relaxing into something more comfortable. Ellen smiled, back in her element. "And these are values you connect to your faith as well, right?" she asked, the question seeming innocent enough, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't quite ready to let the earlier tension dissipate completely. Chuck held her gaze for a moment before responding. "They're universal values, Ellen. But yes, they align with my faith." A brief silence followed, not awkward, but weighty. Ellen seemed to be considering her next words carefully. "You know," she said finally, her voice taking on a conversational tone that nonetheless carried clearly through the quiet studio, "I've always wondered about people with really strong faith. Doesn't it ever feel limiting? Like there are questions you're not allowed to ask?" It wasn't a mockery this time, but a genuine question edged with challenge. The audience seemed to sense the difference, leaning forward slightly. Chuck didn't answer immediately. He took a breath, his hands remaining relaxed in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "In my experience," he said, "faith isn't about avoiding questions. It's about facing them with a foundation. The biggest questions I've encountered about purpose, about suffering, about why we're here, my faith doesn't eliminate those questions. It gives me a place to stand while I wrestle with them. A woman in the third row nodded slowly. Beside her, a younger man who had been scrolling on his phone during the commercial break now looked up, his attention caught. Ellen tilted her head slightly. But doesn't believing in something you can't see or prove scientifically require? I don't know. Turning off part of your brain? There was no laughter this time. The question hung in the air, genuine if pointed. In the control booth, Sam leaned forward, watching Chuck's face on the monitor with intense focus. Chuck smiled a real smile that reached his eyes and softened the weathered lines of his face. Actually, it's the opposite. Faith has made me more curious, not less. More willing to ask difficult questions, not fewer. How so? Ellen asked, her usual rapid-fire pace replaced by something more measured. Because I don't fear where the questions might lead. Chuck replied simply. When you have a foundation you trust, you can venture into uncertain territory. You can face doubts without being destroyed by them. The studio was utterly silent now. Not the uncomfortable silence of social tension, but the rare silence of genuine attention. Even the crew members visible in the wings had stopped their usual movements, watching. But what about when science contradicts faith? Ellen pressed, her tone respectful but persistent. Or when your prayers aren't answered. Doesn't that shake your foundation? Chuck considered this, his expression thoughtful. You know, Ellen, I've been knocked down in real fights. I've failed auditions. I've faced criticism and mockery. I've lost people I loved. His voice grew softer, more personal. Those moments test you, but that's different from destroying you. Ellen nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression, a subtle change from challenge to curiosity. The way I see it, Chuck continued, faith isn't a shield from life's hardest questions. It's the strength to face them honestly. A man in the front row exhaled audibly, not quite a sigh, but a sound of recognition. Several audience members nodded. But you're Chuck Norris, Ellen said, a hint of her earlier lightness returning. You're literally famous for being unbeatable. Are you saying even you have moments of, what? Vulnerability? There was no mockery in her tone now. Only genuine inquiry, mixed with the faintest note of surprise. Chuck smiled again, this time with a quiet humor. Every day. The difference is what I do with those moments. Ellen tilted her head, clearly intrigued despite herself. What do you mean? Strength isn't about never feeling weak, Chuck said, his voice carrying easily across the studio, despite its gentleness. It's about what you build in those moments of weakness. Faith gives me somewhere to direct that vulnerability, not to hide it, but to transform it. The camera panned across the audience, capturing faces that had transformed from mere spectators to engaged listeners. In the third row, a middle-aged woman dabbed discreetly at her eye. That's, Ellen began, then paused, something genuine breaking through her professional veneer. That's actually pretty beautiful, Chuck. Chuck nodded in acknowledgement, his expression warm but unassuming. A silence settled over the studio, not the awkward pause of dead air that producers dread, but a moment of shared reflection. Ellen glanced off stage, perhaps expecting a signal to wrap up. But Sam made no move to cut to commercial or end the segment. Something rare was happening, and he recognized it. You really are something else, Chuck, Ellen said finally, a note of respect in her voice that hadn't been there before. Chuck's response was simple but landed with unexpected weight. We all are, when we remember what grounds us. The audience exhaled collectively, a sound like gentle wind through leaves. Someone in the back began to applaud, not the automatic response to a punchline or a cue card, but a genuine expression of appreciation. Others joined in, the sound building naturally until it filled the studio. Ellen watched, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Surprise, respect, and perhaps a touch of something like wonder. She looked down at her notes, then set them aside entirely. "We'll be right back," she said. As the applause began to fade, her voice softer than her usual energetic sign-off. As the on-air light dimmed, the studio remained quiet, not with tension this time, but with a kind of reverence that rarely appeared in the polished, controlled world of daytime television. In the control booth, Sam lowered his clipboard, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he murmured to no one in particular, "that wasn't in the script." On stage, Ellen leaned toward Chuck, her microphone temporarily disabled. Whatever she said was meant for him alone, but the cameras caught the genuine smile that crossed his face in response, the smile of someone who had come not to win an argument, but to share a truth. The energy in the studio had shifted completely by the time the on-air light illuminated again. During the break, several audience members had approached the stage, hoping to catch Chuck's attention. The security guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man who normally maintained professional detachment, had stepped forward not to intercept them, but to manage the spontaneous line that had formed. Ellen watched this unusual development with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Talk show audiences typically remained in their seats during breaks, their attention diverted to their phones or conversations with their neighbors. But now, a dozen people waited patiently at the edge of the stage, their expressions earnest. "2 minutes, Ellen," a production assistant called. Ellen nodded, then turned to Chuck. "You've got quite the fan club forming." Chuck glanced at the waiting audience members, his expression warm but unassuming. People respond to authenticity. Sometimes, they're just looking for permission to be honest about what matters to them. Ellen studied him for a moment, something shifting in her expression. For a career built on quick quips and gentle mockery, Chuck's steadiness presented something novel. A challenge not to her authority, but to her perspective. In the control booth, Sam leaned toward his assistant director. "Let's adjust the closing segment. Keep it loose. I think we might get something special here." The countdown began, and the waiting audience members reluctantly returned to their seats, many casting glances over their shoulders at Chuck. As the cameras began rolling again, Ellen straightened in her chair, her professional smile firmly in place, though her eyes carried a new thoughtfulness. "Welcome back to the show," she said, turning toward the audience. "We've been having quite the conversation with Chuck Norris today." She paused, her usual rapid patter giving way to something more measured. "And I have to say, it's not going quite how I expected." A ripple of knowing laughter passed through the audience. Ellen smiled a genuine expression rather than her camera-ready grin. "Chuck," she continued, turning back to him, "before the break, you said something that stuck with me about vulnerability becoming strength. That's not exactly the image most people have of Chuck Norris. The guy who, according to the internet, can slam a revolving door." The audience chuckled, but their attention remained focused, expectant. "I've found those jokes entertaining," Chuck acknowledged with a slight smile. "But they're just jokes. Real strength is much quieter." "What do you mean by that?" Ellen asked, her usual host's cadence slowing to match his thoughtful pace. Chuck considered for a moment. "The strongest people I've known weren't the loudest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who remained steady when everything around them was chaos. The ones who stood by their principles even when it cost them." Ellen nodded slowly. "That's not what sells movie tickets, though." "No, Chuck agreed with a gentle laugh. Movies need action, drama. Real strength is often invisible until it's tested. A man in the second row leaned forward in his seat, completely engrossed. Next to him, a young woman had stopped filming with her phone, simply listening. "Have you ever felt tested?" Ellen asked. Her question surprisingly personal. Not in a film, but really tested? For the first time, Chuck's steady gaze shifted slightly, looking past the cameras toward some private memory. When he spoke, his voice carried a depth that silenced even the rustling sounds of the studio audience. "When my daughter Dina was diagnosed with cancer at 17, that was a test," he said quietly. "When my brother Whelan died in Vietnam. When my marriage faced challenges. Those moments don't care about your black belts or your movie contracts." The studio was absolutely still. Ellen's expression had softened completely, the last traces of her performative persona falling away. "How did you get through those times?" she asked. The question simple but profound. "One day at a time," Chuck replied. "With prayer, with community, with the understanding that strength isn't about never faltering, it's about continuing to move forward even when you do." In the front row, an older woman nodded, her eyes glistening. Beside her, a man in his 30s who had been checking his watch earlier now sat completely still, his attention fixed on the stage. Ellen seemed to hesitate, weighing something internally. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its performative quality entirely. "You know, I've spent a career making people laugh, finding the joke, keeping things moving. It's easier sometimes to mock what we don't understand than to—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Than to sit with the questions," Chuck offered gently. "Yes." Ellen nodded, something vulnerable crossing her features. "Exactly that." The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing the rare authenticity of the moment. In the control booth, Sam made a subtle gesture to the camera operators. "Stay with this, don't cut away." "Faith isn't the absence of questions, Ellen," Chuck said, his voice carrying easily despite its gentleness. "It's the courage to face them without cynicism." Ellen was silent for a moment, her usual quips nowhere to be found. When she spoke again, her question seemed to come from somewhere genuine. "Has your faith ever been shaken? Really tested?" Chuck's expression remained open, his eyes steady. "Of course. Faith isn't certainty. It's trust. Despite uncertainty. The testing is part of the journey." A young man in the audience who had been scrolling through his phone now looked up, his attention caught by something in Chuck's tone. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with carefully styled hair wiped discreetly at her eye. "You're making me think about things we don't usually talk about on daytime TV," Ellen said with a small laugh, though there was no deflection in her tone now, only honesty. "Sometimes those are the only things worth talking about." Chuck replied simply. Ellen nodded, setting her note cards aside completely. "You know what amazes me most? I've spent the last 20 minutes basically challenging everything you believe in, and you haven't gotten angry or defensive once." Chuck smiled, a genuine expression that softened the weathered lines of his face. "Getting angry wouldn't have served either of us, and defensiveness comes from fear. Fear that your foundation might not hold. I don't have that fear." In the third row, a man in a business suit who had been checking his watch throughout the show now leaned forward, his expression attentive. Beside him, a young woman who had been filming earlier had put her phone away entirely, simply listening. Ellen shook her head slightly, a look of genuine wonder crossing her face. "You really believe it, don't you? All of it?" "I do," Chuck answered, the simplicity of his response carrying more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. The studio had fallen so silent that the soft hum of the air conditioning was audible. No one shifted in their seats, no phones buzzed. Even the usual subtle movements of the crew had stilled. "I think that's what I find most fascinating," Ellen said finally, her voice thoughtful. "In a world where everything seems to change by the minute, where cynicism is practically a requirement, you found something that anchors you." Chuck nodded. "That's exactly what faith is, Ellen. Not a set of rules or a political stance, an anchor in shifting seas." The metaphor seemed to resonate with Ellen. She sat back slightly in her chair, her expression open and contemplative in a way rarely seen on the carefully crafted show. "We should probably wrap up," she said finally, though without her usual energy. "But I have one more question. If that's okay?" Chuck nodded, his attention unwavering. "With everything you've accomplished, the championships, the films, the books, the charity work, what do you hope people remember most about Chuck Norris?" It was a standard closing question for celebrity interviews, but the context had transformed it into something more meaningful. The audience leaned forward slightly, waiting. Chuck took a moment to consider, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the hushed studio. "I hope they remember that whatever strength I had came not from myself, but from something greater. That the fights that mattered most weren't the ones on screen, but the ones fought with patience and faith and love. And that true power isn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself." The silence that followed was profound, not the awkward pause of dead air, but the reverent quiet of recognition. Someone in the back of the audience began to applaud, not the automated response to a punchline or a cue card, but a genuine expression of respect. Others joined in, the sound building until it filled the studio. Ellen watched, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. When the applause began to fade, she turned to the camera, her expression uncharacteristically solemn. "We'll be right back after this break," she said simply. As the on-air light dimmed, the usual bustle of a commercial break was notably absent. The audience remained in their seats, many turning to their neighbors in quiet conversation. On stage, Ellen leaned toward Chuck, saying something the microphones didn't catch. Whatever it was, made him nod in response, his expression gentle. In the control booth, Sam lowered his clipboard, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. To his assistant director, he murmured, "Well, that definitely wasn't in the script." The assistant director nodded, eyes still on the monitor showing Chuck and Ellen in quiet conversation. "No," he agreed. "It was better." When the cameras rolled again after the commercial break, the studio had a different energy, not the manufactured excitement of daytime television, but something more authentic and subdued. The audience sat attentively, many having used the break to move closer to the stage rather than to check their phones or chat with their neighbors. Even the lighting seemed different somehow, still bright, but less harsh, as if the technical crew had instinctively adjusted to match the shifted mood. Ellen had composed herself during the break, but there was a new quality to her presence, less performative, more genuine. She smiled at the camera, but it wasn't her usual broad grin. Instead, it carried a hint of something thoughtful, almost vulnerable. Her posture was more relaxed, hands resting easily in her lap, rather than gesturing with her typical animated energy. "Welcome back," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt unscripted. "We're here with Chuck Norris, and we've been having a conversation that, I have to admit, has taken me by surprise." She turned toward Chuck, who sat exactly as he had before, calm, attentive, present. "In a good way," she added with a small, genuine smile. Chuck nodded in acknowledgement, his weathered face creasing slightly with warmth. The lines around his eyes spoke of years lived fully, not just the action-filled moments captured on camera, but the quieter battles fought away from the spotlight. "You know," Ellen continued, her tone conversational but sincere, "I've interviewed thousands of people on this stage over the years. Actors, musicians, presidents, royalty. But there's something different about how you carry yourself, Chuck. It's like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It's like you have nothing to prove." A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. In the front row, an older man with salt and pepper hair nodded emphatically, leaning forward in his seat. Beside him, a young woman who had been filming earlier now simply watched, her phone forgotten in her lap. "That's a journey in itself," Chuck replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravel that years of living had etched into it. "When you're young, you're always trying to prove something to others, to yourself. That need fades with time and perspective." Ellen leaned forward slightly, her usual performance falling away completely. "Was there a moment when that changed for you? When you stopped needing to prove yourself?" Chuck considered the question, his gaze drifting momentarily, as if looking into the past. His hands, calloused from decades of martial arts training, strong yet controlled, rested easily on his knees. When he spoke, his voice was reflective, carrying the weight of lived experience rather than rehearsed anecdotes. "There was a moment," he said finally. "It wasn't dramatic, no lightning bolts or burning bushes." He smiled slightly at his own reference. "I was at a martial arts tournament in 1988. I'd been retired from competition for years, but I was there as a guest of honor. A young fighter approached me after winning his division, cocky, full of himself. He challenged me right there, in front of everyone." The audience leaned in collectively, caught by the story's echo of the familiar Chuck Norris mythology. Ellen, too, seemed drawn in, her usual quick responses nowhere to be found. In the control booth, Sam gestured silently to the camera operators. "Stay with this, don't cut away." "What happened?" Ellen asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Nothing," Chuck replied simply. "I declined. Politely, respectfully, but firmly." Ellen's eyebrows rose slightly. That's not how the Chuck Norris jokes would end the story. A ripple of gentle laughter passed through the audience. Not the usual uproarious response to Ellen's quips, but something more appreciative, more connected to the moment unfolding before them. Chuck laughed too. A warm, genuine sound. "No, it's not." The young man was insistent. "Said I was afraid, that I wasn't the legend everyone claimed." The crowd was watching. There was pressure to respond, to defend my reputation. "But you didn't?" Ellen said, not a question but a realization. "I didn't," Chuck confirmed. "I wished him well with his career and walked away." Later that night, I was reading my Bible in the hotel room, and I came across a passage that struck me. "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world, but lose his soul?" And I realized something profound. "What was that?" Ellen asked, her voice soft with genuine curiosity. The usual quick wit and readiness to turn any moment into a joke had completely disappeared, replaced by an attentiveness rarely seen on the polished show. "That true strength has nothing to do with what others think of you," Chuck said. "It's about being at peace with who you are and what you stand for." That young fighter needed to prove something. I didn't, not anymore. The studio was utterly silent, every face turned toward the stage. In the third row, a middle-aged woman dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a tissue. Behind her, a young man who had been scrolling on his phone throughout the show now looked up, his attention caught by something in Chuck's tone. "That's—" Ellen began, then paused, something shifting in her expression. "That's actually pretty profound, Chuck." Chuck shrugged slightly, not dismissively, but with humility. It's a lesson I'm still learning every day. We all are, I think. Ellen nodded slowly, her usual rapid-fire hosting rhythm completely abandoned. Earlier, before the break, you mentioned fighting battles with patience and love. Can you tell us more about that? It was a genuine question, not a setup for a joke or a transition to another topic, but a request for understanding. The audience seemed to sense this shift, their attention focused with unusual intensity. Even the cameraman, typically rotating between shots with professional detachment, seemed captivated, their movements more deliberate, almost reverent. Chuck took a breath, his weathered hands resting easily on his knees. The studio lights caught the slight silver glint of the small cross pendant that hung around his neck, not flashy or ostentatious, but present, like the faith it represented. The hardest battles are rarely physical, he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. In my life, the real tests came when my daughter was diagnosed with cancer at 17. When my brother Wieland died in Vietnam. When my first marriage failed despite my best efforts. Ellen nodded, her expression solemn. Those aren't enemies you can roundhouse kick. No. Chuck agreed, a sad smile crossing his face. And that's when you discover what real strength is. It's not about overpowering an opponent. It's about persevering when everything in you wants to give up. It's about finding hope when circumstances suggest there is none. He paused, his gaze momentarily distant. When my brother died, I was angry at the war, at the world, at God. That anger could have consumed me. Many veterans I've known, it did consume them. What changed for you? Ellen asked softly. I realized that anger wasn't honoring Wieland's memory. Chuck replied, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the subject, and it certainly wasn't helping me move forward. So I had to learn a different kind of strength, the strength to grieve without bitterness. To remember with love instead of anger. In the third row, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Beside her, a man in military dress uniform nodded almost imperceptibly, his expression a complex mixture of recognition and respect. And your daughter? Ellen asked, genuine concern in her voice. Is she? She's well. Chuck nodded, a smile warming his features. 20 years. Cancer. Free. But watching her fight that battle that showed me what courage really is. Not fearlessness, but moving forward despite the fear. Ellen's expression softened with relief. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, Chuck acknowledged. There were nights I paced hospital corridors, questioning everything I believed in, wondering where God was in all of it. And did you find an answer? Ellen asked, the question gentle but direct. Chuck considered this, his expression thoughtful. Not an answer that would fit neatly in a sound bite, he said finally. But I found presence. Not just God's presence, but the importance of being fully present myself for my daughter, for my family. Sometimes strength isn't about having answers, it's about showing up when there are none. The audience was utterly silent, not the uncomfortable silence of social tension, but the rare silence of genuine attention. Even the crew members visible in the wings had stopped their usual movements, simply listening. And your faith during that time? Ellen asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Did it change? It deepened, Chuck replied. Not in the way people might expect. Not with certainty or easy answers, but with questions and struggles. Real faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the path isn't clear. A man in the second row nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Beside him, a younger woman who had seemed distracted earlier now leaned forward, completely engaged. "You know," Ellen said after a moment, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability rarely heard on the polished show. "I think what strikes me most is how peaceful you seem. Even earlier, when I was, let's be honest, mocking what you believe in, you never got defensive or angry." There was a murmur of acknowledgement from the audience, a recognition of the truth in her words. In the control booth, Sam exchanged a glance with his assistant director, both recognizing they were witnessing something rare in television, a moment of genuine authenticity. Chuck smiled gently. "Getting angry or defensive wouldn't have served either of us, Ellen. And it certainly wouldn't have demonstrated the faith I claim to have." Ellen shook her head slightly, a look of genuine wonder crossing her face. "How do you do that? Stay so centered when someone's pushing your buttons?" "Practice," Chuck replied, with a small laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Lots of practice. And remembering that responding with anger or pride only creates more distance between people. I'd rather build bridges." The sincerity of his response seemed to touch something in Ellen. She glanced down at her notes, then deliberately set them aside. Completely a subtle but significant gesture for a host known for her carefully crafted segments. "Would you?" She hesitated, then continued. "Would you share a story about when your faith really made a difference? Not just in a general sense, but a specific moment when it changed how you responded to something." It was a request that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the interview. Too personal, too sincere for the light-hearted show. But the atmosphere had transformed so completely that it felt natural now, even necessary. Chuck nodded, taking a moment to consider. The studio remained hushed, the usual subtle sounds of a television set, whispered directions, shuffling papers, equipment adjustments completely absent. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of lived experience. "In 1999, I was filming in Toronto," he began. "During a break, I went for a walk alone, just to clear my head. I passed a homeless man on the street, younger guy, maybe 30. He recognized me immediately and started following me, asking for money, getting increasingly aggressive. The audience watched intently, caught by the unexpected story." Ellen leaned forward slightly in her chair, all traces of the entertainer's mask completely set aside. "The old Chuck Norris, the one who needed to prove himself, might have reacted differently," he continued. "But instead, I stopped and really looked at him. I saw past the dirt and the anger to the person beneath someone's sun, someone who had dreams once. I asked him his name. It caught him off guard completely." "What was his name?" Ellen asked softly. "Michael?" Chuck replied. The name spoken with a respect that acknowledged the dignity of the person it belonged to. "He told me he'd been a construction worker before an injury, and addiction took everything. We talked for nearly an hour, right there on the sidewalk. I ended up taking him to dinner, calling some local resources to help him find shelter and support." "Did it work?" Ellen asked, leaning forward slightly. "Did he get help?" Chuck's expression grew thoughtful. "I don't know the end of Michael's story. I hope so. But that's not really the point of the story." "What is the point?" Ellen asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "The point is what happened in me," Chuck said simply. 20 years earlier, I might have seen him as a threat or an annoyance, or just walked past without seeing him at all. Faith changed how I saw him, not as someone to fear or avoid, but as someone with inherent worth and dignity, regardless of his circumstances." The studio was completely silent as his words settled. In the front row, an older woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Behind her, a young man who had been fidgeting with his phone throughout the show now sat completely still, his attention fixed on the stage. "That's beautiful, Chuck," Ellen said finally, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed studio. And honestly, convicting. I'm not sure I would have stopped. We all have moments we're not proud of, Chuck replied without judgment. The question is whether we learn from them. Ellen nodded slowly. I'd like to think I would. But it's easy to get caught up in the bubble, the celebrity, the schedule, always rushing from one thing to the next. It is, Chuck agreed. That's why I try to start each day with reflection. To remember what actually matters before the world starts shouting its priorities at me. Ellen smiled, a genuine expression rather than her camera-ready grin. Maybe I should try that. You're welcome to join me at 5 a.m. for meditation and Bible study, Chuck offered, with a twinkle in his eye. Ellen laughed, a real laugh. Unscripted and genuine. I might need to work up to that. Chuck smiled in return, the moment of levity lightening the atmosphere without diminishing the depth of the conversation. Chuck Norris, Ellen said, her voice warm and sincere as she extended her hand. I thought I was inviting a martial arts legend and action star to my show today. Instead, I got a masterclass in grace, humility, and what real strength looks like. Thank you for that. Truly. Chuck took her hand, his grasp firm but gentle. Thank you for the conversation, Ellen. Real conversations are rare these days. As they shook hands, the audience rose to their feet, applause building. Not the prompted enthusiasm of a studio audience following cue cards, but a genuine expression of appreciation that swelled naturally to fill the space. In the front row, the security guard, a tall, stoic man who had maintained professional detachment throughout the show, nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that carried its own weight. Ellen turned to the camera, her expression more solemn than her usual sign-off. We'll be right back with more after this break, she said simply. As the on-air light dimmed and the show cut to commercial, the usual bustle of a break was notably absent. The audience remained standing, many turning to their neighbors in quiet conversation. A woman in the second row wiped tears from her eyes, while behind her, a young man who had seemed bored at the beginning of the show now stood with a thoughtful expression, as if turning over something important in his mind. On stage, Ellen leaned toward Chuck, saying something the microphones didn't catch. Whatever it was made him nod in response. His expression gentle, not the rehearsed warmth of a celebrity, but the authentic presence of someone who had learned to value connection over performance. In the control booth, Sam lowered his clipboard, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Now that, he said quietly to his assistant director, is good television. The assistant director nodded, her eyes still on the monitor showing Chuck and Ellen in quiet conversation. Not just good television, she replied. Something that actually matters. The final segment of the show passed in a blur of warmth and genuine connection. Ellen had abandoned her prepared questions entirely, instead allowing the conversation to flow naturally, a rare departure for the meticulously produced show. They discussed Chuck's charity work with at-risk youth, his ranch in Texas, and his upcoming book on finding purpose beyond success. The audience remained unusually engaged, their attention fixed on the stage with an intensity rarely seen in daytime television. When the closing music began to play and Ellen thanked Chuck one final time, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. Not the prompted enthusiasm of a studio audience following cue cards, but a genuine expression of appreciation. Chuck acknowledged it with a humble nod, his demeanor unchanged from the beginning of the show. Calm, centered, present. As the on-air light dimmed for the final time and the house lights came up, the usual post-show exodus was notably absent. Instead of rushing for the exits, many audience members moved toward the stage, forming an impromptu line along its edge. Some clutched notebooks or phones, but most simply waited, as if hoping for one more moment of connection with the man whose quiet strength had transformed an ordinary talk show into something memorable. Behind the cameras, Sam approached Ellen as she stood from her chair, running a hand through her short blonde hair. His expression was difficult to read, a mixture of surprise, respect, and something that might have been wonder. "That was," he began, searching for the right word. "Unexpected," Ellen finished for him, her expression thoughtful. "In the best possible way." Sam nodded, glancing at Chuck, who was now surrounded by audience members, not clamoring for autographs as might be expected, but engaged in earnest conversation. A middle-aged woman was speaking to him with tears in her eyes. Chuck listened attentively, his focus entirely on her words. "The social media team says it's already trending," Sam said, checking his tablet. "Clips are going viral. 'Chuck Norris silences mockery with grace' is the top hashtag." Ellen watched the scene for a moment, something shifting in her expression. "For once, I don't care about the metrics," she said quietly. Sam raised an eyebrow, surprised by the comment from a host who typically reviewed audience numbers and social engagement with meticulous attention. 20 years in television had taught him that hosts like Ellen lived and died by their ratings, their value measured in views, shares, and engagement statistics. Yet here she stood, seemingly indifferent to what would normally be considered a major success. Before he could respond, a young production assistant approached, tablet in hand, her expression betraying the urgency that always followed a live broadcast. "Ellen, we need you for the promotional photos with the next guest," she said, glancing nervously at her schedule. "They're set up in Studio B. We're already running 5 minutes behind." Ellen nodded, but her attention remained on Chuck for a moment longer. "I'll be right there," she said, then turned to Sam. "Give me a minute." She moved toward Chuck, who was now speaking quietly with an elderly man at the edge of the stage. The man was describing something with animated gestures, occasionally tapping his heart. Chuck listened with complete attention, nodding occasionally. As Ellen approached, the man thanked Chuck and stepped back, wiping discreetly at his eyes before merging back into the small crowd. "Chuck," Ellen said, extending her hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. Again, that was not what I expected when we booked you for the show." Chuck took her hand, his grasp warm and firm. The calloused palm spoke of years of disciplined physical training that had shaped not just his body but his character. "Thank you for the conversation, Ellen," he replied, "for letting it become something real." Ellen nodded, a complexity of emotions crossing her features. In the harsh studio lights that typically flattered on camera but revealed every flaw off-screen, she looked suddenly vulnerable. Not the polished entertainer, but a person wrestling with something unexpected. "You know," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "I had a whole different segment planned. More jokes about the Chuck Norris facts, a martial arts demonstration with some staff members, light-hearted stuff. That would have been fun too." Chuck replied with a genuine smile. "Maybe," Ellen acknowledged, "but not meaningful. Not like this was." She hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry about earlier. The mockery. About your faith. That was already forgotten," Chuck assured her, his expression sincere. Ellen studied him for a moment, her professional mask completely set aside. "How do you do that? Just let it go so easily?" Chuck's response was simple, but landed with unexpected weight. "Holding on to offense only hurts the person holding it." Ellen seemed to consider this, nodding slowly. "I should have that embroidered on a pillow in my office." They both laughed, the sound genuine and warm. A production assistant appeared at Ellen's elbow, gesturing discreetly toward the exit. her expression growing increasingly anxious. "I have to go," Ellen said, glancing at the waiting crowd of audience members, still hoping to speak with Chuck. "But seriously, thank you. For your patience. For your grace." Chuck nodded in acknowledgement, his expression warm but unassuming. As Ellen turned to leave, he added, "Ellen?" She paused, looking back. "The conversation doesn't have to end here," he said simply. "If you ever want to continue it." Something flickered across Ellen's face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. She nodded, a small but genuine smile forming. "I might take you up on that." As she walked away, trailed by assistants with clipboards and schedules, her posture seemed different. Less the confident stride of a celebrity, more the thoughtful gait of someone processing an unexpected encounter. Backstage, the usual post-show bustle continued, crew members striking sets, production assistants coordinating the next day's schedule, talent being escorted to waiting cars. Chuck moved through it all with quiet ease, stopping to thank each crew member who approached him, taking time to sign autographs for those who asked. Near the exit, a young stagehand carrying coiled cables paused, watching Chuck with barely concealed admiration. "Mr. Norris," he said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say that was really something. What you said about strength. It meant a lot." Chuck stopped, giving the young man his full attention. "What's your name?" "Miguel," the stagehand replied, shifting his cables to extend a hand. Chuck shook it firmly. "Thank you, Miguel. That means a lot to hear." The young man nodded, something unspoken passing between them before he continued with his work, standing a little straighter than before. As Chuck neared the final exit, the security guard who had stood watch during the show, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cropped hair and an impassive expression, stepped forward from his post by the door. "Mr. Norris," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of unusual emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you." Chuck tilted his head slightly, giving the man his full attention. "For what?" The guard seemed to consider his words carefully, his usually stoic expression softening slightly. 20 years with studio security, I've seen hundreds of celebrities come through. Most are different off-camera, smaller somehow, or louder, or just not what you'd expect." He paused, then added with quiet sincerity, "You're the same person on both sides of the camera. That's rare." Chuck extended his hand. "What's your name?" "James," the guard replied, his handshake firm. "On." "Thank you, James," Chuck said simply. "That means a lot." As James stepped back to his post, Sam approached, clipboard tucked under his arm. Unlike earlier, when tension had radiated from his every movement, he now seemed relaxed, almost peaceful. "Your car is ready, Chuck," he said. "And I just wanted to say that was something special today. Really special." Chuck nodded in acknowledgement. "It felt that way to me too." "The network's already asking about a follow-up appearance," Sam continued, his producer's instincts never fully dormant. "Maybe a longer segment or a special." Chuck smiled slightly. "Let's see where the road leads." Sam nodded, understanding the gentle deflection. As they walked toward the exit, the producer's curiosity seemed to get the better of him. "What made the difference?" he asked, his voice lower now. "When Ellen was, well, when things got tense. Most guests would have gotten defensive, or angry, or just shut down. You did something else entirely." Chuck considered the question, his pace unhurried despite the waiting car. "In martial arts, there's a principle. You don't meet force with greater force. You redirect it. Transform it into something else." Sam nodded slowly. "And that works with everything? Not just physical confrontation?" It's not always easy. Chuck acknowledged with a slight smile. I'm still practicing after all these years. But yes, the principle is universal. They reached the exit where a black SUV waited, engine idling in the California afternoon Sunday. Sam extended his hand. Thank you again, Chuck. Truly. As Chuck slid into the back seat of the car, he caught sight of his reflection in the window, the same weathered face that had looked back at him that morning, unchanged by the events of the day. The driver pulled away from the studio, merging into the steady flow of Los Angeles traffic. Chuck watched the buildings slide past, his thoughts turning to the unexpected path the interview had taken from lighthearted mockery to something authentic and meaningful. Not because he had defended himself or proven anything, but because he had remained steadfast in who he was. His phone buzzed with a notification. A text from his wife. How did it go? He smiled, typing simply, God showed up. Another notification appeared, a news alert, with a clip from the interview, already gaining traction. He didn't click on it. The moment hadn't been about publicity or vindication. It had been about connection, about meeting mockery with grace, about standing firm in your beliefs without needing to force others to accept them. The car turned onto the freeway, accelerating away from the studio complex. Chuck closed his eyes briefly. A silent prayer of gratitude, forming in his mind not for his performance, but for the opportunity to share something real in a world that too often settled for the superficial. 3 days later, in Ellen's office, the production team gathered for their weekly content meeting. The glass-walled space overlooked the studio lot. Morning sunlight streaming across the polished conference table, where writers, producers, and segment directors sat with their coffees and tablets. The room buzzed with the usual energy of ideas being pitched and schedules being finalized. Ellen sat at the head of the table, coffee cup in hand, listening as her writers presented concepts for upcoming segments, celebrity game ideas, viral video reactions, dance challenges. And finally, Sam said, sliding a tablet across the table as the last writer finished, I thought you should see this. Ellen glanced down at the screen, which displayed a social media analytics page. At the top was a clip from Chuck's interview, the moment when he had quietly responded, No, but he taught me when not to fight. The view counter showed over 20 million, and climbing. Below it were comments from viewers. Never seen Ellen speechless before. Powerful moment. Chuck Norris didn't need his fists to win this one. This is what real strength looks like. No shouting, no anger, just quiet confidence. I'm not religious, but damn, respect to Chuck for handling that with such grace. Watching this made me want to be a better person. No joke. Ellen scrolled through the comments, her expression thoughtful. After a moment, she looked up at Sam. What are people saying about my part in it? Sam hesitated, then replied honestly. Mixed. Some criticism for the mockery. But most people are focused on how the conversation evolved, on how real it became. Ellen nodded slowly. It did become real, didn't it? She set the tablet down, her gaze distant for a moment before refocusing on the team. I've been thinking about that interview a lot. The writers exchanged glances. Unused to Ellen dwelling on past segments, she typically moved forward relentlessly, always focused on the next show, the next bit, the next viral moment. What if, she said, leaning forward slightly, her usual energetic demeanor giving way to something more thoughtful, we tried something different with the show. Not all the time, but occasionally. Real conversations, less performance, more. I don't know. Authenticity? The room fell silent, the usual rapid-fire exchange of ideas momentarily paused. A young writer with purple-streaked hair looked up from her notes, clearly surprised. Across the table, the head comedy writer raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "The show works because it's light, fun," he offered cautiously. "People tune in to laugh, not for deep talks." Ellen nodded, acknowledging the point. "True. But what if they're hungry for both? What if we could give them the laughter and the substance?" Sam was the first to respond, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think," he said carefully, "that could be extraordinary." Ellen nodded, her decision seeming to crystallize in real time. "Let's start planning it. A special segment. Maybe once a month. We'll call it." She paused, considering, then finished with quiet certainty. "Unscripted." As the meeting continued, ideas flowing with renewed energy, Ellen's gaze drifted to the window, overlooking the bustling studio lot. The encounter with Chuck had shifted something in her, not dramatically, not completely, but noticeably. A reminder that beneath the performance, the punchlines, the carefully crafted persona, there was something else waiting. The possibility of connection, of meaning. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The conversation doesn't have to end here, Chuck." Ellen smiled, something settling within her as she typed a response. "I'd like that." Outside her office window, Los Angeles continued its perpetual motion, cars flowing, people rushing, cameras rolling. But within the stillness of the moment, something had changed. Not with fanfare or dramatics, but quietly, profoundly, the way real change often happens. Not with a fight, but with grace. Not with mockery, but with meaning. Not with noise, but with silence that speaks volumes. In a culture that celebrated the loudest voice, the quickest comeback, the most devastating takedown, Chuck had demonstrated a different kind of strength, one that transformed confrontation into connection, mockery into meaning. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of grace at a time. And sometimes, that's how the world changes. Not through grand gestures or viral moments, but through individual encounters, where authenticity prevails over performance, where grace disarms judgment, and where silence speaks louder than words ever could. The lesson lingered, its ripples extending far beyond a single hour of daytime television, touching viewers who shared the clips, crew members who witnessed it firsthand, and a host who, perhaps for the first time in a long career of entertaining others, had found herself genuinely moved. In the quiet aftermath of unexpected grace, the real story had just begun. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.